A team of archaeologists and researchers made a potentially exciting discovery this week in Oklahoma.
We found evidence of a mass burial, of a large burial pit with coffins in an area where our research has told us that it is likely that race massacre victims were buried.
The graves may belong to Black people who died in the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. The massacre saw white mobs destroy the Black neighborhood of Greenwood, killing untold numbers of people. Scott Ellsworth is a historian originally from Tulsa. He describes the Tulsa Massacre as the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. And he's part of a team that's looking for the unmarked graves of massacre victims.
There were two discoveries. There was a discovery of a single coffin and human remains. Again, these are unrecorded burials in this city-owned cemetery. They're in the African-American section of the Potter's Field. Shortly afterwards, in a separate location, which has now been dubbed Trench A, we uncovered the tops of 10 different coffins. They were all roughly at the same level. Most of them were in pairs. You know, the archaeologists on site are of the belief that they were all buried at the same time.
Ellsworth says the team is using some high-tech tools in its search.
We identified a particular area, which was near the two only known headstones for African-American massacre victims. We then brought in ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetometers and other devices. Anomalies were discovered there. We began the excavation of the anomalies, earlier this week, and so things have happened quite quickly.
But challenges remain.
The condition of the bones is really quite fragile, fairly poor. And that's going to be a challenge to be able to determine whether the scientists can see signs of trauma and whatnot, whether we can make certain these are massacre victims.
Ellsworth says respect for the dead and their families is the most important thing.
These are all homicide victims. Their families were never able to grieve for them. We're hopeful, but we're not sure. We might be able to use DNA to identify some of them, but we may not be able to. But they were, in my mind, thrown away by the white authorities while their families were being held under armed guard, never told what happened to their loved ones. So our feeling is that as soon as we can study these remains, it's going to be important to rebury them with honor as soon as possible.
The dig is part of a national reckoning with one of history's darkest chapters.
This is going to be a very important event in the history of the city of Tulsa. And I think that these, potentially, if these are massacre victims, if they're buried in a place of honor and there's a memorial, that I think that will attract attention nationwide.
This is Inside Edition Digital.